खोजो 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 खोजो.
This is going to be a very, very interesting conversation with my very good friend, Dr. Uday Kulkarni. And we are very honored to have Meenakshi ji here on our panel as well. So let's get right to it, right? I think the Maratha Empire, as was discussed just now, how many of you here have heard about that empire? One of the things that we see or think is outside of Maharashtra, not many people have even heard about it, right? And the standard perception here in our history is we had the Mughals through the 17th century, and then we had the British in the 19th century. And 18th century was this era of chaos where, you know, a lot of small things were going on, some fights were going on, there were a lot of regional powers. And then there was this big loss at Panipat. Suddenly the Marathas come out of nowhere and lose at Panipat. Nothing how it got there. And then there's Plassey, and we are told that after Plassey, the British pretty much took over. And that's quite far from the truth, but for whatever reasons, that's the history that most of us have learned, some in Maharashtra and many outside Maharashtra. What Dr. Kulkarni has been able to do through his series of books about the 18th century is talk about an empire, a power that was essentially the key power in the 18th century, and that took power from the Mughals. And finally, it was the British who had to take India or capture India from this power. So we're going to learn about this. Dr. Kulkarni, let's get to the title of this session. It said magnificent. But magnificent in what way? Is it in terms of the monuments they built, or in terms of the strategy they had, or the odds that they were against, or some of the reforms they did? Why magnificent?
Let me look at the way I look at it. Magnificent is actually usually addressed to buildings, monuments built by great emperors like you see in Delhi or Agra. The Marathas did not leave such monuments behind, built in marble and Pietre Dura and such things. But their monuments are basically in the forts. If you come to Maharashtra, there are over 500 forts built in basalt stone. That was their architecture. And they did not have time to build pleasure palaces because they were too busy fighting a very stubborn enemy whom they overcame and spread throughout the 18th century. Now about these magnificent Mughal monuments, they remind you that there was a dynasty which ruled here, because when you look at a monument, you wonder who built it, and that gives you the clue that there must have been a dynasty which built them. But I just wanted to give a quote about one of the authors who wrote the history of India along with Romila Thapar, that was Percival Spear. And it's very interesting to note what this gentleman wrote. He was a teacher of history. He taught in several Delhi schools. And he says that prestige dictated display in the form of personal pomp or magnificent buildings. To this we owe the Mughal architectural heritage from the Taj Mahal downwards. They were the Mughal equivalent of Marie Antoinette's chocolate cake for the peasants. You could look at them but not subsist on them. The nobles followed the imperial example. If the emperor was building a huge mausoleum for his wife, the nobles followed that. And they virtually confiscated their fortunes at death. When all these drafts had been made upon the annual national surplus of the country, little remained for productive works. And Percival Spear in the end says, a few fine bridges and sarais, a few trunk roads, and the repair of Firoz Shah's canal to Delhi leave little else to be added. The Mughals preferred a garden to a canal, and their officers a tomb to a well. So the great opportunity of spreading the concentrated national surplus on productive work was missed. India was the scene of much economic activity, but little economic progress. So what you see in these monuments is the money of the people, which was squandered on a display of their own prestige, and which was something which is today called magnificent, but the Marathas probably would be called magnificent for the ideology for which they spread their empire.
So let me come back to the 18th century. You've argued in your books about how this was one of the last indigenous empires from which the British captured. But if you go back 500 years, in North India especially, large parts of India, this was the first indigenous empire as well. Can you talk a little bit about that and how this transition came about? Starting with, I know it's a tough ask, but starting with Chhatrapati Shivaji in the 17th century, how did this Swarajya begin and end up being a Samrajya in less than 100 years?
Actually, if you go back to the history, if you go in the 13th and the 14th century, that is when the invasions which started in the 12th and 13th century in the north, they gradually spread through the peninsula. And at various places, there were various kingdoms and empires which built up. And uniformly, if you find, there was discrimination against the indigenous population on economic, social, as well as political grounds and based on their faith. Now, this was something which was not sufficiently resisted until the arrival of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. He was the man who realized that we have to build, get out of this thraldom, of this slavery which we have been imposed upon us. And that is why he first enunciated the word Swarajya. I'll put it to you that Swarajya as a word has been used only twice in Indian history. First when Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj used it, and the second time when Lokmanya Tilak used it. And both these times we were actually under some kind of slavery. Because the Mughals and the Delhi Sultanates which were ruling over us were essentially Turco-Persian people, Afghan people who ruled over here. And the sign that they were aliens was very simple. The test for that is very simple. All you have to see is the court language, the standard religion which was followed, the system of promotions which was offered. There's an excellent book by Athar Ali of Aligarh Muslim University where he lays down the mansabdaris given during the Mughal period from Akbar to Aurangzeb. And you'll find the highest mansabdaris were reserved for those who came from Turkic and from Persian descent. And even the Rajputs and the Marathas had to make do with very small amount of mansabs. The clause was very simple. If you want to rise socially, economically, and in your political career, you have to convert. And from that point of view, it was a kind of operation which was on the indigenous people. That's why I say that after 500 years of foreign rule, the Marathas were the first indigenous empire of India, and it was also the last indigenous empire of India before the British took over. Today, if you look back at your history of the last 800 years, you would find if this 175-year empire was not there, there would be very little for you to look back and feel proud about and hold your head high. And that is the importance and the magnificence, as it is said, of the Marathas. And that's why it is important that sooner or later our textbooks start bringing out these things, and that has been the purpose of my entire exercise of writing these books.
Yeah, I think, and you have done an amazing and stupendous effort. Meenakshi ji, let me come to you. We were talking about this magnificent empire as well. So two questions, and you can pick the order. How was it magnificent to you in terms of, as Dr. Kulkarni mentioned, in terms of preserving some of the Indic traditions that and culture that we had lost for 500 years? And secondly, how is this known outside of Maharashtra?
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, I have to confess that I have not read this book because I got it late in the evening yesterday and I had to hand it over to them today morning. But at night, the little time that I got, I was able to flick through the book, and the whole night I was disturbed. Living in North India, being an academic, I was not aware that India had produced a historian of Dr. Kulkarni's caliber who has devoted his life to bringing back to us a very, very glorious chapter in our history. You know, he has documented photographs, he has found rare documents, produced them in the original, then translated them. It's an absolute mine of information. Now I feel very sad that as an academic who was teaching in Delhi University, this great Maratha history of which we should all be so proud was really not much known to me. We had learnt a little bit about Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, but only in the most derogatory terms that Aurangzeb referred to him. And the contribution of the Marathas in preserving and restoring our civilizational heritage is something that we should all remember and bow our heads to. The Madhav Rao, who is the subject of this book, he died when he was hardly 27. And his last will, young man of 27, he dies of tuberculosis, but his last will, which has been presented by Dr. Kulkarni. Imagine a person is dying and he's writing in his will to his successor, you must recapture Kashi, Ayodhya, Prayag. So that sense of identification with the land was something that the Marathas exemplified so well in this period. And, um, and you know, there's so many instances that he has documented. And I just want to mention one or two. You know, there was in the 16th century, when the Mughal Empire was at its peak, 6 Maharashtrian Brahmin families came from the Deccan and settled in Kashi. Now, that was a period when Mughal might was at its peak. But these 6 Maharashtrian Brahmin families with no money, with no state power, they thought that it is their civilizational duty to come to the land of Kashi. And they come there, and it's amazing what they do there. One family, they take the initiative to rebuild the Kashi temple. In the time of Akbar, their Todar Mal is the revenue minister. He's in charge of this area. And this Maharashtrian family tells him that it's your duty to rebuild the Kashi temple. So this Maharashtrian Brahmin family, with the help of Todar Mal, builds the Kashi Vishwanath temple. And great-grandson of this same family, sitting in Kashi, far away from the western Deccan, when Shivaji runs away from the Agra fort, he provides him shelter at Kashi and arranges for his safe travel back home. And when Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj reaches Raigad, this person travels to Raigad and tells him, it is my duty to coronate you as king, as Chhatrapati, because you have to deal with so many powers, you should deal with them with equality. So he arranges and presides over the coronation ceremony of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Can you imagine this kind of association, dedication, and love for this heritage of this country? This is something that the Marathas, they exemplify so beautifully. The Marathas under the Peshwas, they have to fight the Nizam, they have to fight the Hyder Ali, they have to fight the Mughals, they have to fight the East India Company. They are the ones who go up till Attak and Cuttack. So, when the Maratha army reaches Attak, there is Diwali celebrated in the Maratha Peshwa camp, that Attak se Cuttack tak. Now Maharashtra Rajya is there. So, it's very difficult for us to visualize that there could be a community in the medieval period, dark medieval period, surrounded by such hostile forces, but is not relenting and is fighting its level best to retain the grandeur of this civilization.
So, Meenakshi ji, let me come to the key point, right? Why is this unfortunately not so well known outside of Maharashtra, and these days increasingly even inside Maharashtra?
I don't know about inside Maharashtra, but I can certainly say outside Maharashtra, in Delhi, this does not figure in our curriculum at all. The reasons, it's for anyone to guess. There was perhaps a natural bias against the great and brave sons of this soil, and there was a tendency to exaggerate, glorify another dynasty of this period, which record was not all that great and glorious in any case. And you mentioned Athar Ali's book on the Mughal nobility. So that book says that 70% of Akbar's nobility, Akbar whom we regard as the greatest of the Mughals, 70% of his nobility was reserved for Irani and Turani, people who had come from Iran and Central Asia. The rest, 30%, was divided between Indian Muslims and Rajputs. And Akbar chose these two communities with great care because he knew that no foreign noble will revolt against him with the leadership of either the Rajputs or the, Indian Muslims. So, we can go on trying to exonerate, whitewash the ugly aspect of the medieval period, but you just have to scratch beneath the surface and realize what they did to our culture and polity.
I think that's very well put. And thanks to books like what have been written by Dr. Kulkarni, we hope that they will help in setting the record straight. One of the things, I mean, as a Maharashtrian, as a Punekar, I have to admit that over the last 50 years, not much new work. There was, of course, a lot of great historical work done 50, 100 years back by the likes of Sardesai, even Yadunath Sarkar. But lately, a lot of the work was, if whatever was done was in Marathi. So a great thing Dr. Kulkarni has done is brought this work out in English. And it's going to be translated in other Indian languages as well. So this is finally stepped out of the Marathi fold. And people all around India and people around the world are now reading about it. Now, one thing that I would like to ask you is, since we have just 15 minutes, so we can't really go into the full description of the century. So let's talk about a few misconceptions that are there, and let's take them head on. So, for example, one of the ones that I mentioned up front, that Panipat was end of the Maratha Empire. Was it?
Actually, if you go into the reasons why Panipat was fought, it was fought by people in the far south of the country in the defense of India and the invaders coming from the northwest frontier. You must realize Ahmad Shah Abdali had come on his fifth invasion of India in 1759. And it was the strongest paramount power in India at that time was the Marathas. In 1752, the Mughal emperor had signed a treaty called the Ahdnama, by which he entrusted the protection of the Mughals from internal and external enemies to the Marathas. So it was a responsibility they had undertaken as early as 1752. And in 1757, when Abdali came, he not only looted Delhi, and he looted it to such an extent that all the animals and the horses and the donkeys were also taken away from here. There was not even a washerman's donkey left to carry the treasure away. After that, he went to Mathura and Vrindavan, where he massacred the pilgrims. It is said the waters of the Yamuna there ran red for several days. That's a scale of massacre which was carried out. And when he went back, the Marathas followed him, and Raghunath Rao and Mallara Holkar, these names may seem new to you. They followed him, captured Delhi, and entered the Punjab and captured Lahore, Attock, Peshawar, and Multan. So these four cities which are today in Pakistan were under Maratha rule for no less than 18 months. At Lahore, Raghunath Rao Peshwa was approached by the Shah of Iran at that time, saying that you come from the east and I will come from the west, and let us crush Abdali between us. You take Kabul, I will take Kandahar. And Raghunath Rao writes to Nana Sahib Peshwa in Pune that I say this offer has come, but Kandahar was part of India till Shah Jahan's time, and why should we give it away to Iran? So that was the concept of India's borders in the Maratha mind, and you can imagine Lahore was almost 1,500 miles from where Pune was, so supply lines was heavily stretched. Now Punjab was the province from where Abdali got most of his resources, because it was a rich province. So immediately the Marathas entered Punjab, immediately got rid of his difficulties in his own country, and he was welcomed by the Rohilla chief here called Najib Khan, who was at Najibabad. He came down with 60,000 soldiers. Dattaji Scindia was defending Delhi at that time. He was killed on Makar Sankranti Day in 1760. And in the south, there was a huge victory won over the Nizam around the same time. And a large army was sent north to face Ahmad Shah Abdali, because he would not go back in the summer months as he usually did. He settled down in Anup Shahar on the Ganga. And he was supplied by all his friends there, the Rohillas, who were in the Doab, in the Trans-Ganga region, Shujaud Daula, Awadh. They all became his allies. And a large army from the south came to evict this invader, and Sadashivrao Bhau, who was leading that army, you find him writing to Shujaud Daula that first let us get rid of this invader, apas ki baat we can settle later on. So this was the concept. I think this was one of the earliest enunciations of the Indian nation, or at least the political boundaries of what was understood as India. So the Battle of Panipat, which fought, it was a near-run thing. There's a document written by a historian in Abdali's camp, where he says at one stage the Marathas came so close to Abdali, who was always in the back of his army, that he mounted his women on fast camels and horses, so if the Marathas reached them, they can be taken away to the nook of safety. That is the limit to which they had almost won the battle, when a bullet struck their prince, Vishwasra, who was an elephant, and that set off a chain of events which finally led to the debacle that happened at Panipat. But have you ever heard of the Marathas actually, after winning a battle, slaughtering the non-combatants? If you see, when Bajirao came to Delhi in 1737, you find he writes to his brother that I could have burnt the suburbs of this city, but Delhi is a Mahasthal, and destroying the suburbs of the city will break the cord of diplomacy with the emperor. In 1739, when the Portuguese were evicted from Vasai, his brother Chimaji Appa, who won that great victory and evicted the Portuguese from northern Firangan, as it was called, north of Bombay, the entire area was liberated. He let the Portuguese dependents with their ladies march out of Vasai fort with their band, beating their band and going on to ships supplied by the English to go back to Goa. So that was the way the Marathas, in the Bharati Yuddha as they called it, they let off their enemy. On the other hand, after Panipat, the non-combatants were made to stand in a line. They were given a few drops of water and some gram on their hand to eat, and their heads were chopped off. Every chief of the Abdali army had pyramids of chopped heads before his tent to show what a great victory he has been. So this was the kind of cruelty which you found after Panipat. And the battle was fought for the frontier of India. Today, if that battle had not been fought, today you find that the river Satluj is almost 200 kilometers. It forms the boundary of India. That boundary, as one famous political leader long back had said, had that battle not been fought, today Pakistan would have been on your doorstep. The entire Indo-Gangetic plain and the West and East Pakistan would have probably joined together across that. So this battle laid the grounds of that the boundary will be Satluj. When Abdali went back from Delhi, he wrote a letter to the Peshwa that I hand over the administration of Hindustan to you, and you continue with Shah Alam as the emperor, who was that time an absentee emperor. He was sitting in Allahabad. And he went back, and thereafter it was kind of formalized that Satluj will be the border of India. And you find even today, that is the boundary between India and Pakistan.
No, I think, Meenakshi, you wanted to add something.
Yes, I wanted to say something. When we are talking about the Marathas, it's very important for us to remember that large parts of sacred cities in North India that we see today are rebuilt by the Marathas in the 18th century. Kashi that we see today, there was nothing of Kashi left. All the buildings, sacred buildings of Kashi, were destroyed in one invasion after another. And the record of destruction of temples in Kashi has been meticulously maintained in Persian histories that were written at that time, because they were very proud of what they were doing. So in the 18th century, when Mughal power was in decline, then the proud Marathas, they come to sacred cities like Kashi, and they rebuild the ghats, they rebuild temples. One lady, Ahilyabai Holkar, she builds two important temples which are so important as in our civilizational journey. She rebuilds the Kashi temple that we see today. It's a small little temple because that main area of the temple was occupied by the masjid. She could not displace that, but in the ancient Hindu tradition, she rebuilds the temple as close as possible to the original site. And she rebuilds the temple at Somnath. We've all heard of Mahmud Ghaznavi's attack on Somnath, then Alauddin Khalji, then it goes on. But I just want to take 1 minute. What is important about the temple at Somnath? When you go to a temple, the main image that is to be worshipped is in the center of the temple. In Somnath, the image is not in the center. In the center is a small staircase leading to the basement. That staircase is so small that only one or two people can go down at a time. And the ling is put in the basement, which gives you an idea of how strong that fear of iconoclasm was when Mughal Empire was past its prime. So when we go to Kashi, when we go to these places, we should remember these brave and valorous sons and daughters of this country,
Yeah, I think thanks for highlighting this. Dr. Kulkarni, briefly talking about Madharao specifically, since that's the subject of your most recent book, just to give a quick context to everyone here. Bajirao, which many of you have heard, made popular by a movie, and that's a separate discussion. But Bajirao's son was Nanasaheb Peshwa, who saw the farthest extent of the empire just before Panipat. And then in the great loss of Panipat, Nanasaheb Peshwa himself passed away very quickly. And a young Madhavrao essentially took charge at age 16. And with such a big loss in front of him, he was able to recover and redeem a lot of Madhavrao, and his team was able to get back control over Delhi. Can you briefly talk about that? And I also, I mean, again, we have limited time, but I want to talk a little bit or get your thoughts a little bit about Marathas in Delhi over multiple decades, in that 5 or 6 decades that happened after that as well.
Just 12 years after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, 1719 was the first time Maratha armies came to Delhi. 30,000 Maratha troops were in the city of Delhi in 1719, who were brought there by the Sayyid chief Hussain Ali. And under using their power, the then emperor Farrukh Siyar was deposed and a new emperor was put in his place. That was the first visit of the Marathas to Delhi proper. Although reaching Delhi has always been an aim right from Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. His son Rajaram Maharaj, there's a letter available where he says that I have kept aside 300,000 hone. Hone was a currency of those days valuing about 5 rupees per hone for the capture of Delhi. And that time he was under siege in the fort of Jinji in Tamil Nadu. But the vision was that one day we will capture Delhi. When 1719 was the first time they came there. In 1737, I mentioned Bajirao reached Delhi because he wanted to force Muhammad Shah, who was the emperor, to cede Malwa to the Marathas. After 1737, when Abdali invaded India, Muhammad Shah invited Nanasaheb Peshwa to come to his help in 1748, and Nanasaheb Peshwa came to Delhi and met the emperor, but by that time Abdali had already been defeated. That was the first invasion of Abdali. In 1752, you find that the Wazir, Safdar Jung, whose name is associated with several monuments here, was defeated by the Rohilas. And he sent men to Scindia and Holkar that please come and help me. So they rescued the Wazir from the Rohilas, and the Wazir and the emperor at that time signed the Ahadnama, which granted several provinces to the Marathas in exchange for protection of the Mughals from their internal and external enemies. The next arrival here was in 1754-55, when they again came here under Raghunath Rao. They came back here in 1758, again under Raghunath Rao. 1759, Dattaji Shinde was here trying to defend Delhi against Abdali once again. 1760, Sadashivrao Bhau with a large army was here. Till 29th of January 1761, when Abdali entered Delhi and handed over the city to his protege, who was Najib-ud-Dawla of Najibabad. And when the Marathas retreated from Panipat, there was an upsurge of enemies around. The Nizam of Hyderabad, Hyder Ali from the south, Shuja-ud-Dawla crossed the Jamuna and took the fort of Jhansi. Najib-ud-Dawla was in control of Delhi. You find even some Rajput princes attacking in the Marathas and the battle taking place between them at that time. So the first part of my book talks about the abyss that they had fallen into. Besides, there was civil war raging into their own house. Madhavrao was 16 years old and his uncle wanted to grab all the power in his hands. And the first 2 years were spent in defeating the Nizam till August 1763. The Nizam was so decisively defeated that he never raised his head in the south for the next 30 years. Following that, there were 3 or 4 campaigns against Hyder Ali. Hyder Ali was defeated every time. An indemnity of 32 lakh rupees was taken from him every year for every defeat that he sustained under Madhavrao. In 1771, on the outskirts of Srirangapatnam, there's a temple heritage town called Melukote, where Hyder and Tipu had to run away from the battlefield dressed as beggars. And that is a very well documented chapter in the capture of the Carnatics right up to the Srirangapatnam region. Thereafter, a large Maratha army came to the north in 1769, and after subduing several enemies, they captured Delhi in February 1771. The Shah Alam, who had proclaimed himself emperor, was that time an asylum under the English. And in 1771, it was he who was escorted to come back to Delhi and occupy the throne here, with promises of territory and money again. Now everybody wonders, why did they put the Mughal emperor back
Yeah, I
on
guess
the
that's
throne?
a question I was going to ask. I mean, that's a question. Why did they not occupy the throne themselves?
For one, Delhi was far away from their power center, which was in Maharashtra, in Pune. Secondly, the Chhatrapati Shahu and subsequent Chhatrapatis had no desire to shift their base from Pune and Satara and come and rule in Delhi. The Peshwas were the prime ministers of the Chhatrapati. So if the king or the sovereign was not willing to come to Delhi, there was no way the prime minister could have established his rule in Delhi. So they never, the policy of the Marathas was very simple, to allow the Mughal to reign, but the rule was by the Marathas because they were following the dictates of what the Marathas were doing them. And because the Mughal emperor after 1760 was merely a puppet, he was a phantom actually, they could easily control him. And you find that from 1771 onwards, almost till 1803, barring a year or two in between, the Maratha flag was flying on the Red Fort. Shah Alam was being protected by the Scindias. Mahatji Scindia was here till 1794. After that, his troops were here till 1803. And the most important evidence of this, you just have to cross the river, go to Noida, visit the golf course, and see the large monument there to the Battle of Patparganj, which was fought between the East India Company and the Marathas. Delhi was captured not from the Mughals. Delhi was captured by the East India Company from the Marathas. And therefore, the entire myth that the Mughal emperor gave way to the British Empire is completely false.
I think that's a key point that unfortunately
just,
very few people, even in Maharashtra, know very well.
I just want to add one of the things. We are talking about the Marathas and we are bringing in the Mughals. I think all of us should remember that Shivaji, though he fought Aurangzeb for such a long time, he never vandalized a mosque. So when we talk about the Marathas, we have to be very clear that they may have whatever the reasons for waging of war, they were very conscious of their heritage. They were determined to preserve and protect that heritage, but they never vandalized another mosque or Eidgah. Second point is that I just want to continue what you said about the Battle of Panipat. The invitation to the Afghans to invade India was actually given by a Delhi cleric, Shah Wali Ullah. Now, Shah Wali Ullah wrote many letters to the Afghan ruler, Ahmad Shah Abdali, and said, that, everywhere the sound of the azan will stop because the Sikhs and the Marathas and the Jats, they are coming to power everywhere. So it's your duty to protect the faith and come and invade India. This invitation to an outsider to come and attack India was a feature like Babur is supposed to be invited to India to attack India by the Lodi governor of Bengal. Now, I just want to conclude this thing by saying that when the battle for Panipat was about to be fought, the Marathas repeatedly told the Nawab of Awadh that look upon it as a battle between us Indians and a foreigner. So don't side with the foreigner because he is belonging to your faith. So this was the kind of vision that they demonstrated, but unfortunately, their plea fell on deaf ears, and the Nawab of Awadh and the Rohillas, they chose to side with Abdali only because of the commonality of religion, where the Marathas said, look upon it as a battle between us of the subcontinent and foreigners.
I think very well summarized. I think there are two or three things, as Dr. Kulkarni mentioned, since again we are here in Delhi, if next time you are in Noida, near the Noida golf course, you would know where the most important battle for Delhi in 1803 was fought. Similarly, next time you are near the Talkatora Stadium, that's where Bajirao won a battle in 1737. So there are a lot of these small landmarks, if you will, associated with the Marathas, right here where we are sitting, right? The other point that I like to highlight a lot about Panipat, and it's a simple geographical statement. You can look at it on the map, on a Google map today. The distance from Kabul to Panipat is actually a lot less than distance from Pune to Panipat. So that will give you an idea of who was fighting on, in sense, home turf, because after you come down Khyber Pass, they were essentially the plains of Punjab, and it was a fairly smooth journey for Abdali, where the Marathas had to cross the Narmada, the Vindhyas, the Satpuras, the Chambal, and through that entire reach Delhi. So Marathas had stretched their power that far, and that was one of the reasons why some of their supply lines, as Dr. Kulkarni talked about, were strained. And but I'll just mention that Dr. Kulkarni has written an entire book about the Battle of Panipat. In fact, that was his first book that made him into a historian. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Kulkarni, I'll again re-emphasize, is actually a retired Navy officer. He's a Navy surgeon who took up writing history just about a decade back. And I mean, I'm not an academician, so I'm going to ask that question to Meenakshi ji.
Yeah.
But the kind of work that he has done is probably worth multiple PhDs. I can say that as a layman.
Yes, actually, when we were students of history, then the standard book for us was Sardesai's 3-volume History of the Marathas. It was very meticulously researched. There is no doubt about the scholarship. But when I compared that book with Dr. Kulkarni's work, I'm reminded of how people say that historians, they make history very boring. So that Sardesai's book really seems so boring in comparison, because he has, put life and blood and made those people living people for us. I mean, you brought history alive, and it's a real joy to go through and the kind of documentation, I don't know from where he has got these rare documents. He knows Marathi, he has gone to England, got the archival material, paintings. He has published a whole book on Wales, what's his name?
James Wales.
James Wales, who was the painter in India of the East India Company at that time. So he's collected all the paintings of that person and produced a volume on that. So I think that, this session we should dedicate to Dr. Kulkarni. And since he's written history in such a relatable manner, we should all buy his books and at least read them. I've been enchanted with his book since yesterday evening.
Thank you very much. I couldn't have put it better. Dr. Kulkarni, we have about 5 to 6 minutes. We'll take a few audience questions, but I wanted to give you one last word to talk about the book, and then we will get a few questions from the audience.
I'll speak a few words about my journey, how I strayed into history.
Sure.
Sometimes last week somebody asked me, how come you're a surgeon and how did you do history of all, what kind of an aberration is this? So looking back at the last 60 years of my life, I've begun to feel that probably the surgery was an aberration and history was my vocation, because in school I wrote my first book in history. And of course now surgery I've reduced a lot. I'm devoting more time to writing more books because I have to go a long way. I have to finish the entire period till 1818, and I hope I get the time to do it in the next 10 years. So basically, I strayed into this because there was a lot of annoyance, I would say, when I read histories written by others. And most of these people who have written histories in English have not referred to the Marathi documents at all, because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of letters which were never translated into English. They've always been, the last of these books were published probably 100 years back. They are very difficult to get. A few university libraries, probably Deccan College in Pune. That's all that, even they're not even been digitized and put on the internet. And getting those books together from 2007, I used to get books from the library and I used to literally photograph it page by page. I must have taken about 60 to 70,000 photographs because I had to build my own library on my hard disk. And that is why during the COVID period in 2.5 years when I was sitting at home and I couldn't visit any library, I could write 3 books because all the references were at my fingertips. And even
Amazing.
this book I could finish in 2 years because all the references are on my hard disk today. So that angst against the kind of history written by English authors, even today, the way they are referred to, they usually tiptoe around the Maratha period because they don't know much about what the Marathas have done. And they try to avoid the issue or brush it under the carpet, thinking that the reader will not notice, and most of the time they get away with it. That is my observation. And therefore I had to set the record straight. And nobody knew who is Uday Kulkarni in 2010 when I started writing this book on Panipat, because I wanted to release it on the 250th anniversary of the battle on the 14th of January 2011. And I had no time to find a publisher, so I decided I'm going to start my own publishing firm, and that is working quite well, thank you, for the last 12 years. Because I don't have to answer an editor, I don't have to answer a publisher, I don't have to see what he is doing with my book, what are the production values of the book, what kind of paper he is using, what is the design of my cover. It's all in my own hands. So I would recommend all the authors over here that please try self-publishing once, and you'll realize the benefits of it. You don't have to go from door to door to publisher asking him, please publish my books. They are not worth the effort, let me tell you that.
I think you should write a separate book about self-publishing someday, because you're right, it will help so many of the, especially young authors out here.
Astonishingly, in the world of academia, self-publishing is looked down upon as some kind of, a lower level of writing.
Yeah.
I thoroughly disagree with this, because you will find a lot of trash published by these publishing houses. And most of it is trash, actually. So when you put your name on a book, you have to ensure that you have to claim that responsibility that you have written it. Otherwise, don't put your name there.
So, audience questions, quick. We'll take a couple of them. Is there a mic by any chance? There's a hand up here. Please get a mic quickly so we can get more questions. Yeah, maybe we'll take 2-3 questions and then we'll answer.
So I've read 2 of your books, as we've discussed. But I think the aspect that perhaps the rest of the world needs to know a lot more about is the role of the remarkable Maratha women. 100 years before Jane Austen was writing her books where English women were only looking for husbands, you had Jijabai, Yasubai, 2 great queens. But you also had Tarabai, who actually defeated Aurangzeb. Last 7 years of Aurangzeb's life, he was defeated by Tarabai, a woman. That's the ultimate ignominy, I think, for this male chauvinist. And then there is also Ahilyabai, of course, which you've talked about just now. There was Lakshmibai, and I think 1858, 758 was actually a Maratha-led revolutionary war. So please don't stop at 1818, take it to 1858. And also, of course, there was Baijabai, who I think is the unsung heroine also.
Today we talk of gender equality. In the Maratha household, there has been gender equality from the 17th and 18th centuries. It was not just Jizabai, Shivaji Maharaj's mother. It was, as you said, Yesubai, Tarabai. Later on in the Peshwa period, there was Radhabai, who was Bajirau's mother. She was a very strong lady. Till the 1750s, she had a very strong say in the administration. Nana Sahib's wife, Gopika Bai, who lived long till 1784, and her word counted even in Madhurau's days. Later on, as you said, Ahilya Devi, who has, of course, done so much work which all of us know. Baizabai, who was the wife of Daulat Rao Shinde, and of course, Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi. So all these, the 4 main leaders of the 1857 revolution, as you call it, were basically proteges of the last Peshwa at Bithur. It was Rani Lakshmi Bai, it was Tatya Tope, it was Nana Sahib Peshwa and Rao Sahib Peshwa. So these were the 4 main leaders who actually fought the 1857 battle from Kanpur. And somehow they have been reduced to a second level leadership, which was really not the case.
Ma'am, I understand that there is need to rewrite the history. Where is the Northeast in this image?
I'm saying that history, many parts of India have been neglected. Northeast is one of them. Today we're discussing the Marathas, who have been totally ignored. You see, so Northeast, as you rightly say, but we are not part of the curriculum, we are not part of the syllabus making thing, so we cannot say anything on this. But individual efforts are being made, like Vikram Sampath has written a little bit on the Northeast, he has written on Lachit, Dr. Kulkarni is producing so much on the Marathas. So, now the discipline is actually democratized. Anyone can venture and write something on an area which has been neglected. The only thing is that your sources have to be meticulous, you have to do detailed research. Don't depend on the state to do everything. It will not do anything.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to close on. So I would like to thank Meenakshi ji and Dr. Kulkarni. Once again, Dr. Kulkarni's books are self-published and they're available on Amazon.in. So please do check them out and do take a look at this period of history that's not that well known. Thank you very much.
Kojo, Kojo. खोजो खोजो खोजो